So, when you think of the Crusades, what pops into your head? Is it knights in gleaming, polished armor, banners fluttering in the desert wind, on a noble quest for God and glory? Yeah, that's the Hollywood version. That's the romantic, simplified fairy tale we've all been sold at some point. A straightforward story of good versus evil, faith versus heresy, us versus them. It's clean, it's epic, and it's almost entirely wrong. The real story is, to put it mildly, a whole lot messier. It's a sprawling, centuries-long saga of intense faith, yes, but also of blinding ambition, political maneuvering, breathtaking incompetence, and staggering violence. This wasn't just a clash of civilizations, it was a chaotic collision of 1,000 different agendas, often wrapped in the convenient packaging of a holy war. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to pull the thread on that tapestry. We'll journey from the moment a pope promised heaven in exchange for bloodshed to the brutal, chaotic reality of the First Crusade. We will see how a bunch of European nobles tried to run a kingdom in a land they barely understood, and how spectacularly it all went wrong. We'll meet the legends, like the brilliant Saladin and the hot-headed Richard the Lionheart, and see the less-than-legendary parts of their stories. We'll even witness the moment the whole holy enterprise went completely off the rails, and Crusaders started sacking other Christian cities because, well, reasons. This isn't just a story about forgotten battles and long-dead kings. It's the origin story for a division between East and West, between Christianity and Islam, that has left scars we can still see today. It's a story about what happens when people are absolutely, terrifyingly certain that God is on their side. So, settle in. We're about to unpack the entire, complicated, and often unbelievable history of the Crusades. Forget the shining armor, this is history for the real world. The very word in crusade is a bit of a historical retcon. The people who actually went on the First Crusade didn't call themselves in crusaders. They saw themselves as peregrini, pilgrims, or crucis agnati, meaning enthos signed with the cross. They were, quite literally, taking up the cross. Before heading out, they would stitch cloth crosses onto their clothes, a physical symbol of their vow. It was a public declaration of a sacred oath, a holy mission to reclaim the Holy Land for Christendom. That sounds pious enough, but the term crusader itself has become loaded. We use it today to describe everything from a political campaign against littering to a marketing push for a new soda. It's become a generic term for any passionate or righteous struggle. But in the medieval context, it had a very specific theological weight. A crusade was a holy war, but a very particular kind. It was framed as a defensive pilgrimage authorized directly by the Pope, the supposed vicar of Christ on earth. And it came with the ultimate sales pitch fight for God, and you get a plenary indulgence. This was essentially a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card. All the sins you had committed, no matter how nasty, would be wiped clean. For a deeply religious, and frankly incredibly violent society, that was an offer too good to refuse. But here's our first major critical turn. Was this really just about faith? Or was faith the perfect cover story, the divine justification for much more earthly ambitions? Think about medieval Europe at the time. It was a pressure cooker of violence. You had a warrior class of knights with not much to do besides fight each other over scraps of land. This system, which we now call feudalism, produced a surplus of ambitious, violent, and often landless younger sons. What does a clever institution like the church do with all this pent-up, testosterone-fueled aggression that's tearing society apart from the inside? Well, you don't stop it. You aim it. You point all that violent energy outwards towards a common enemy far, far away. It was, in many ways, a brilliant piece of social and political engineering. Suddenly, the local lord who was burning your village last week is your brother-in-arms, marching for a holy cause. The Pope, by initiating this, places himself at the head of a pan-European army, asserting his authority over kings and emperors. And let's not forget the siren song of wealth. The East was legendary for its riches, its silks, its spices. For a knight whose inheritance was a rusty helmet and a half-starved horse, the idea of carving out a kingdom for himself in the sun-drenched lands of the Levant was intoxicating. So you have this potent cocktail of motivations brewing. You have genuine piety and fear of damnation mixed with raw greed. You have a desire for adventure stirred in with a brutal realpolitik strategy. It's not one thing, it's all of them, bubbling together in a chaotic stew. And this complexity extended to the people themselves. We can't paint every crusader with the same brush. An illiterate peasant who truly believed he was doing God's work is a world away from the calculating Venetian merchant who saw the whole affair as a golden business opportunity. A devout and noble lord, like Godfrey of Bouillon, had different aims than a ruthless Norman prince, like Bohemond, who was purely in it for the territory. They marched under the same banner, but their hearts and minds were on entirely different quests. This brings us to another critical piece of the puzzle we have to establish from the get-go. The world the Crusaders were marching into wasn't some empty, barbaric wasteland. It was the opposite. The Islamic world and the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, for the sticklers, were, in many respects, far more advanced than Western Europe at the time. Their cities were bigger, their science was more sophisticated, and their libraries were filled with the preserved knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome that had been lost in the West. They weren't a monolithic bloc either. The Middle East was a tapestry of competing dynasties, sultanates, and emirates. Sunni and Shia Muslims were often at odds, and the Arab Abbasids, the Seljuk Turks, and the Fatimids in Egypt were all rivals for power. The Crusaders didn't crash a peaceful party, they crashed a very complicated, ongoing one, adding a new and profoundly disruptive element to the region's already volatile politics. Their arrival was, from the local perspective, just another invasion by another group of strange, pale barbarians from the north. And let's be clear about another common misconception. The idea of a crusade wasn't limited to expeditions to Jerusalem. The crusading ideal was a flexible tool, and the popes learned to use it for all sorts of purposes. There were crusades launched against fellow Christians in the south of France who were deemed heretics. There were the Northern Crusades, brutal campaigns to conquer and convert the pagan peoples of the Baltic region. There were even political crusades declared against the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope's main rival for power in Europe. Anywhere the Church saw an enemy, the banner of the cross could potentially be raised, and a holy war declared. This wasn't just an East versus West phenomenon, it was a mechanism of power that reshaped the map and the soul of Europe itself. So, as we prepare to dive into this sprawling, bloody, and endlessly fascinating period of history, we need to shed our modern, romanticized baggage. We have to be willing to look at the heroes and see their flaws, their greed, and their brutality. We have to look at the villains and see their perspective, their culture, and their own forms of nobility. We must understand that faith and greed could live in the same heart, that acts of profound piety could be followed by acts of unspeakable cruelty. Our journey isn't about finding who was right and who was wrong. That's a fool's errand. History is rarely so simple or satisfying. Our journey is about understanding the why. Why did it happen? What drove these people? What were the consequences? It's a story of faith and folly, of ambition and despair, of cultural collision on a scale the world had never seen before. It's a story that laid the groundwork for the modern world in ways we are still struggling to comprehend, creating fault lines and historical grievances that echo to this very day. So, where does a story like this even begin? How do you actually convince tens of thousands of people, from princes to paupers, to drop everything, abandon their homes, and march 2,000 miles to a city most of them had only ever heard of in prayers? It began with one man, one speech, and one of the most effective, influential, and consequential calls to arms in the history of the world. It began with Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095. So, how does a continent go from minding its own business, which, to be fair, was mostly just plague and feudal squabbling, to launching a multi-generational holy war thousands of miles from home? It doesn't happen overnight. It starts with a phone call. Or, in this case, the 11th century equivalent, a desperate plea from a king who was in way over his head. Meet Alexios the Komnenos, the Byzantine emperor. His empire, the last glittering remnant of ancient Rome, was getting squeezed. He sent envoys to the most powerful man in Western Europe, not a king, but the Pope. He was hoping for a few hundred elite, well-trained mercenaries, professional soldiers to help him push back the Turks. What he wanted was a scalpel. What he was about to get was a holy chainsaw wielded by tens of thousands of fanatics, opportunists, and true believers. It's perhaps the most catastrophic misreading of a request in history. Now, let's turn to the man who received that request, Pope Urban II. To understand why he turned a simple call for mercenaries into a global conflict, you have to understand the world he was living in. The papacy was in the middle of a massive power struggle with the secular rulers of Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Emperor. This was a long, messy political feud called the investiture controversy, which basically boiled down to who gets to appoint powerful church officials, the Pope or the King. It was a battle for the soul of Christendom, and Urban saw an opportunity. A brilliant, terrifying, world-altering opportunity. He needed a project, something so big, so undeniably holy, that it would unite the bickering, violent knights of Europe behind a single cause, with him, the Pope, as the undisputed commander-in-chief. It was a political masterstroke dressed up in religious robes. The stage was set. November 1095, Clermont, France. Urban calls a council. After days of dealing with churchy administrative matters, he announces he has something important to say. He moves the meeting outdoors because the cathedral can't hold the enormous expectant crowd. And then, he gives the speech of a lifetime. A speech so powerful it would ignite a fire that would burn for 2 centuries. We don't have a perfect transcript, but from the multiple accounts written later, we can piece together the key ingredients of his sales pitch. First, he laid out the problem. He painted a gruesome, horrifying picture of the plight of Christians in the East. He spoke of churches being desecrated, of pilgrims being attacked and tortured, of holy sites being defiled by one accursed race. How much of this was true? Some, probably. How much was exaggerated for maximum emotional impact? Almost certainly most of it. This was medieval propaganda at its absolute finest, designed to provoke outrage and a thirst for righteous vengeance. He wasn't just talking about defending fellow Christians. He was framing this as a direct insult to God himself. The Holy Land, the very ground where Jesus had walked, was in the hands of infidels. It was an intolerable stain on the honor of Christendom. Then, he pivoted. He turned his attention to the audience right in front of him, the Frankish knights. He flattered them, calling them the most valiant of soldiers, chosen by God. But he also chastised them. He pointed out that they spent most of their time fighting each other. They were ravaging their own lands, killing their own Christian brothers over petty squabbles for land and power. You oppressors of orphans, you robbers of widows, you homicides, you blasphemers, he supposedly said. He held up a mirror to their own violent society. And here comes the genius move. He offered them an alternative, a way out. Stop fighting each other, he urged, and turn your swords against the enemies of God. This was the grand redirection. He was taking the violent, chaotic energy of feudal Europe and aiming it, like a cannon, towards the Middle East. It was a way to solve his local problems by creating a much, much bigger one far away, an external war to create internal peace. And then came the promises, the incentives. Because this wasn't just about doing the right thing. Oh no, there was a rewards package that would make any modern telemarketer blush. The headline offer was the big one. A plenary indulgence, forgiveness for all your sins. This was revolutionary. All that murder, theft, and general nightly thuggery you've been up to, all forgiven. Just take up the cross, march to Jerusalem, and your slate would be wiped clean. It was an unprecedented spiritual loophole, and for a deeply pious, yet deeply violent society, it was an irresistible deal. But Urban knew his audience. He wasn't just appealing to their souls, he was appealing to their wallets. He talked about the riches of the East. He described a land flowing with milk and honey, ripe for the taking. For the countless landless younger sons of nobles, who had no inheritance and no prospects, this was a golden ticket, a chance to carve out their own kingdoms, to seize land and wealth beyond their wildest dreams. It was a holy war, yes, but it was also a colonial venture and a get-rich-quick scheme rolled into one. So you have spiritual absolution on one hand, and the promise of earthly riches on the other. It was a perfect pitch, targeting both the devout and the greedy, and everyone in between. He was selling redemption and real estate. He concluded his speech with a powerful call to action. "Let this be your war cry," he said. "Dios vult, God wills it." And the crowd, whipped into a frenzy of religious ecstasy, roared it back at him. "Dios vult, Deus vult." It was electric. It was hysteria. Men were reportedly weeping, pinning makeshift crosses made of cloth to their tunics on the spot, pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to this new, great cause. The spark had not just been lit, it had started a wildfire. Urban's message spread faster than gossip. Preachers fanned out across Europe, carrying the Pope's call to every corner of the continent, often adding their own dramatic flair and embellishments to the story. The response was overwhelming and far beyond what Urban himself likely anticipated. He had been aiming his speech at the nobility, the professional fighting class. He wanted an army, but his message resonated with everyone. Peasants, artisans, and the poor heard the call and saw it as a chance to escape the brutal misery of their everyday lives. Which brings us to the first, chaotic, and utterly disastrous result of Urban's speech, the People's Crusade. Long before the official army of knights and nobles could even finish packing, a massive, disorganized mob of commoners formed under the leadership of charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit. These people were filled with a fiery, unshakable faith. They truly believed God would protect them, that he would part the seas for them and deliver their enemies into their hands. What they lacked, of course, was training, supplies, discipline, and any semblance of a coherent plan. Their piety was, unfortunately, matched by their ignorance and brutality. As they marched east through the Rhineland, they decided their holy war shouldn't wait until they reached Jerusalem. They saw enemies of Christ much closer to home, their Jewish neighbors. What followed were a series of horrific massacres. Thousands of Jews in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz were slaughtered by the crusading mob, who offered them a choice between baptism and death. This was the first bloody fruit of Urban's call to arms, a grim preview of the horrors to come. This People's Crusade was less of an army and more of a migrating disaster. They pillaged their way across Europe, and by the time they reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This was not the elite fighting force he had asked for. It was a swarm of locusts. He quickly ferried them across the Bosporus into Anatolia, probably just to get them out of his hair. There, they were promptly and predictably annihilated by a disciplined Seljuk Turkish army. Most were slaughtered, the rest sold into slavery, a tragic, pointless end to a movement born of pure faith. So, let's recap. A savvy emperor asks for some professional soldiers. A brilliant and ambitious pope sees a political opportunity and hijacks the request, launching a grand holy war to unify Europe under his command. He offers a divine pardon for sin and the promise of earthly loot. The message goes viral, inspiring not only his target audience of knights, but also a massive, uncontrollable mob of peasants who promptly get themselves killed, but not before committing horrific atrocities along the way. The official crusade hasn't even started yet, and it's already a glorious, bloody mess. This wasn't just a spark, it was a full-blown theological and political explosion. So, Pope Urban II gives the speech of a lifetime at Clermont, and basically invents the medieval equivalent of a viral challenge. He calls for a holy war, an armed pilgrimage to reclaim Jerusalem, promising eternal rewards. But when you put out an open call like that, you don't always get the A-team you were hoping for. Before the knights and nobles could even finish polishing their armor and arguing about who had the best-looking banner, a different kind of army was already on the move. This wasn't the disciplined force of professional soldiers the Pope or the Byzantine Emperor had in mind. This was the People's Crusade, and it was pure, unadulterated chaos. Leading this, let's call it a movement, was a charismatic, wild-eyed preacher known as Peter the Hermit. Peter was the kind of guy who could sell water to a well. He rode around on a donkey, looking the part of a humble prophet, and whipped up a frenzy among the common folk. His followers weren't lords or trained men-at-arms. They were peasants, laborers, and a handful of low-ranking knights, all fired up with a potent cocktail of genuine piety, desperation, and a profound lack of understanding of military logistics. They packed up their families, abandoned their fields, and set off to walk thousands of miles, convinced that their faith alone would protect them. Spoiler alert, it wouldn't. This zealous mob had a very flexible interpretation of holy war. As they marched through the Rhineland, their religious fervor took a dark and monstrous turn. They decided their holy mission should start a little closer to home, by targeting people who didn't share their faith right there in Europe. What followed were the Rhineland massacres, a series of horrific pogroms against Jewish communities. Thousands of men, women, and children were murdered in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. They were given a simple, brutal choice: convert to Christianity or die. This wasn't some unfortunate side effect of the Crusade for many in this mob, this Vosk the Crusade. It was a horrifying preview of the savagery to come, a stark reminder that when you label a group as the other, the consequences are almost always tragic and bloody. Somehow, against all odds, a large portion of this human tidal wave actually made it to Constantinople. You have to imagine the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios the Komnenos, looking out from his palace walls. He had asked the West for a few hundred elite mercenaries to help him fight the Turks, and instead he gets this, a starving, unruly, and completely undisciplined horde of tens of thousands at his doorstep. It was the medieval equivalent of ordering a pizza and having a whole, chaotic circus troupe delivered to your house instead. Alexios, being a shrewd political operator, did the only logical thing. He smiled, welcomed them, and then got them across the Bosphorus into enemy territory as quickly as humanly possible. Out of sight, out of mind, the People's Crusade, full of faith and fury, marched into Anatolia and was promptly annihilated by a disciplined Seljuk Turkish army. It was a massacre, a tragic, predictable, and brutal end to the unofficial opening act of the First Crusade. With the People's Crusade wiped off the map, it was time for the main event, the Prince's Crusade. This was the force Urban had actually envisioned, led by some of the most powerful and ambitious nobles in Western Europe. This was a collection of actual armies, not just a well-intentioned mob, but to call it a unified force would be a massive overstatement. It was more like a collection of rival CEOs on a very, very hostile corporate retreat. First, you had Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious and respected duke. He's often painted as the idealistic leader of the whole affair. He even sold off a lot of his lands to fund his expedition, which suggests he was a true believer. But make no mistake, he and his brother, Baldwin of Boulogne, were also incredibly ambitious. Then there was the wealthiest and, in theory, most powerful of the bunch, Raymond of Toulouse. He was older, more experienced, and deeply religious, but also notoriously stubborn and arrogant. He saw himself as the rightful leader of the Crusade, and was not shy about letting everyone know it. And you can't forget the Normans from southern Italy, led by the cunning and utterly pragmatic Bohemond of Taranto. Bohemond was less concerned with heavenly rewards and far more interested in earthly ones. He saw the East not just as a holy land to be reclaimed, but as a land of opportunity, a place to carve out a kingdom for himself. He was the guy who read the mission statement and immediately started looking for loopholes. These rival factions and their armies eventually converged on Constantinople just as the People's Crusade had. Emperor Alexios was probably relieved to see actual soldiers this time, but his problems were far from over. His goal was simple: use these Westerners to help him recapture Byzantine territory lost to the Turks. The Crusaders' goal was more complicated. Alexios demanded that each of the princes swear an oath to him. The deal was straightforward: any former Byzantine city you recapture, you give back to me. In return, I'll provide you with supplies, guides, and military support. After a lot of diplomatic arm twisting and a few thinly veiled threats, most of the leaders grudgingly swore the oath. Bohemond, ever the opportunist, was probably the first to agree and almost certainly the first to have his fingers crossed behind his back. This oath would become a ticking time bomb for the entire campaign. The first real test of this shaky alliance was the siege of Nicaea in 1097. The city was a major Seljuk stronghold, and taking it was a massive undertaking. The Crusaders, for all their internal bickering, proved to be effective siege engineers and relentless fighters. For weeks, they battered the walls and fought off relief forces. They were on the verge of a full-scale assault, dreaming of the glory and, more importantly, the loot that awaited them inside. But Alexios had other plans. While the Crusaders were preparing to storm the walls, he was secretly negotiating with the city's Turkish defenders. He offered them generous terms of surrender they couldn't refuse. One morning, the Crusaders woke up, ready for a bloody battle, only to see the emperor's personal standards flying over Nicaea. The city had surrendered to him overnight. The Crusaders were furious. They felt completely cheated. Alexios had denied them their prize, their chance to plunder the city for supplies and riches. From a Byzantine perspective, it was a brilliant, bloodless victory. But from the Crusaders' point of view, it was a betrayal. The seeds of mistrust had been sown, and they were about to blossom in the searing heat of the Anatolian desert. After Nicaea, the real journey began. The Crusaders marched into the heart of Anatolia, and it was a brutal, grueling slog. The heat was oppressive, water was scarce, and food ran out almost immediately. This was the part of the pilgrimage that no one put on the recruitment posters. Knights in heavy armor were collapsing from heat stroke, and horses were dying by the hundreds. The grand, romantic quest had devolved into a desperate death march. It was during this march that the Crusaders were ambushed by a massive Seljuk army near Dorylaeum. One contingent, led by Bohemond, was caught completely by surprise and nearly wiped out. For hours, they formed a defensive circle, getting hammered from all sides, on the brink of total annihilation. It was only the timely arrival of the other Crusader armies, led by Godfrey and Raymond, that turned the tide. They smashed into the Turkish flank, and the ensuing battle was a major, hard-fought victory for the Crusaders. It was a huge morale boost, but it also served as a terrifying reminder of just how vulnerable they were. As the main army continued its slow, painful crawl south, one of the leaders decided he'd had enough of the group project. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's ambitious younger brother, saw an opportunity. He took a small contingent of knights and peeled off from the main force, heading east towards the Armenian lands. His goals were pretty transparent. He was looking for a territory to call his own. Baldwin's side quest took him to the city of Edessa. Through a mix of clever politics and intimidation, he convinced the local Armenian Christian ruler to adopt him as his son and heir. It was a brilliant move, but shortly after the adoption, a convenient rebellion popped up. The old ruler was overthrown and brutally killed, and wouldn't you know it, Baldwin was right there to take his place as the new Count of Edessa. And just like that, the very first Crusader state was founded, not on the back of a holy victory against the Seljuks, but through a cold, calculated, and deeply cynical political power grab. Meanwhile, the main army finally reached its next great obstacle, the massive, heavily fortified city of Antioch. If Nicaea was a test, Antioch was the final exam from hell. The siege began in October 1097, and would drag on for nearly 8 agonizing months. The Crusaders weren't prepared for a siege this long. As winter set in, their situation became desperate. Food ran out completely, and the once proud army was reduced to eating its own horses, then dogs, rats, and, according to some horrifying accounts, even the bodies of the dead. Disease was rampant, and desertions became common. The Holy Army was starving, sick, and on the verge of collapse right outside the city walls. This is where Bohemond, the Norman prince of pragmatism, saw his chance. He had his eye on Antioch from the very beginning. He wanted it for himself, that oath to Emperor Alexios be damned. He made a secret deal with a disgruntled Armenian guard inside the city, a man named Firuz, who controlled one of the wall's towers. The price? Gold, land, and a position of power. For Bohemond, it was a bargain. He was about to betray his allies and his emperor to get his prize. In the dead of night, Bohemond's troops scaled the tower, opened the gates, and the Crusader army poured into the city. What followed was a brutal, frenzied massacre. They killed soldiers and civilians alike, driven by months of pent-up frustration and starvation. But their victory was short-lived. No sooner had they taken the city than a massive Muslim relief army arrived and promptly besieged them. The hunters had become the hunted, trapped inside the very city they had just conquered, with barely any food to sustain them. Their situation was now even more hopeless than before. It was at this absolute lowest point that something truly bizarre happened. A poor and, frankly, somewhat obscure priest named Peter Bartholomew began claiming he was having visions of St. Andrew. The saint, he said, had revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross, hidden right there beneath the floor of a church in Antioch. After a lot of digging, in a moment of pure theatrical genius, Peter Bartholomew emerged from a pit holding a piece of iron. Was it the real lance? Almost certainly not. Did it matter? Absolutely not. For the starving, terrified Crusaders, this was the miracle they had been praying for. Their morale skyrocketed. They were convinced God was truly on their side. But emboldened by their newfound relic and whipped into a religious frenzy, the Crusaders did something insane. They threw open the city gates and marched out to face the massive, well-fed army that was besieging them. Outnumbered, exhausted, and on foot, they should have been crushed. Instead, they fought with the fury of fanatics and completely routed the enemy. It was a stunning, almost inexplicable victory that could only be interpreted as divine intervention. And with that, the siege of Antioch was finally over. Bohemond, true to his plan, refused to hand the city over to the Byzantine representative and declared himself the Prince of Antioch, creating the Second Crusader state and shattering his oath to Alexios for good. After a long delay, with the army recovering and the leaders squabbling over what to do next, the now much smaller Crusader force finally began the last leg of its journey. In the summer of 1099, almost 3 years after they had left their homes in Europe, they stood before the walls of their ultimate prize, Jerusalem. The sight of the holy city filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. The end was in sight. But the city was well defended, and the Crusaders had a huge problem. The surrounding area had been stripped of trees, and they had no wood to build the siege towers they desperately needed to take the city. It seemed their quest would fail at the final hurdle. Just when all seemed lost, fate intervened once more. A squadron of Genoese ships unexpectedly arrived at a nearby port, carrying timber, supplies, and skilled engineers. It was another miracle, a crucial piece of luck that turned the tide. The Crusaders immediately set to work building 2 massive siege towers. Under the command of Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, they prepared for the final bloody assault. On July 14, 1099, the attack began. The fighting was ferocious. For a full day, the defenders held them off. But on July 15th, Godfrey's men managed to get their siege tower up against the wall. A few knights scrambled across, and the defenses were breached. The Crusaders poured into the city. And what followed was not a moment of pious reverence, but one of the most infamous and brutal massacres of the medieval era. They killed for 2 straight days. They slaughtered the city's Muslim defenders and inhabitants without mercy. They herded the Jewish population into their main synagogue and set it on fire, burning them all alive. Chroniclers from their own side would later write of the streets running with so much blood that it came up to their ankles. They had come to liberate the tomb of Christ, the Prince of Peace, and they did so by wading through a sea of human blood. It was the ultimate, horrifying contradiction of the entire crusading ideal. The First Crusade was, by all military and strategic measures, a shocking and unprecedented success. A group of bickering, backstabbing nobles had led an army thousands of miles from home, overcome starvation and disease, and conquered a series of heavily fortified cities against all possible odds. They had achieved the impossible. They had captured Jerusalem. They had won. But their victory was built on a foundation of betrayal, greed, and a capacity for human cruelty that was truly staggering. This glorious mess was over, but the consequences of what they had done, and the challenge of holding on to what they had taken, had only just begun. And so, they did it. The armies of the First Crusade, against all odds, managed to carve a slice out of the Levant and capture the holy city of Jerusalem. A staggering, bloody, and frankly improbable achievement. Now what? It's the classic case of the dog that actually caught the car. For years, the goal was simple: if insane, march thousands of miles and take the city. But now they had to govern. And governing a hostile territory thousands of miles from home, surrounded by enemies, well, that's a whole different kind of holy war. This is the story of the Crusader states, also known as Outrima, or the land beyond the sea. And if you imagine them as glorious, stable European-style kingdoms just transplanted to the Middle East, you're in for a surprise. Think less of Camelot on the Jordan and more of a string of heavily fortified, deeply paranoid, and chronically short-staffed military outposts clinging desperately to the coastline. 4 of these states were cobbled together out of the chaos of the First Crusade. You had the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the crown jewel and symbolic heart of the whole enterprise. Then there was the Principality of Antioch, the northern powerhouse full of Norman princes who were notoriously difficult and politically ambitious. Further inland was the county of Edessa, the most isolated, most vulnerable, and ultimately the first to fall. Finally, the county of Tripoli was squeezed in between, a coastal strip essential for trade and communication. Now, the first and most glaring problem for these new rulers was a simple matter of math. The Franks, as the locals called all the Western Europeans, were a tiny, minuscule minority. They were a handful of lords, knights, and soldiers ruling over a vast population of Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, and Samaritans who had been living there for centuries. It was the medieval equivalent of being the new management at a massive company where you don't speak the language, don't share the culture, and all the employees think your business plan was handed down by a vengeful deity. This demographic imbalance shaped everything. There was no grand plan to convert the entire population that was a logistical and practical impossibility. Instead, a system of, let's call it pragmatic segregation emerged. The Franks were the landlords, the military aristocracy, the local population were the tenants and the workforce. They ran the farms, operated the markets, and paid the taxes that kept the whole fragile enterprise afloat. It was less a melting pot and more a carefully layered casserole, with the heavily armed Franks sitting right on top. So how do you control a large, non-Christian population that, for very understandable reasons, isn't thrilled about your presence? The answer was twofold: big walls and elite warriors. First, the castles. The Crusader states became obsessed with castle building, creating some of the most formidable and breathtaking fortresses the world has ever seen. Places like Crac des Chevaliers or the Margat Castle weren't just forts, they were massive statements of power projection. They were military headquarters, administrative centers, and giant stone panic rooms, all rolled into one. These castles allowed a small number of knights to control vast swathes of surrounding territory, offering a refuge for Frankish settlers if, or rather, when, things went bad. But castles are just stone and mortar. You need people to man them. The Crusader states were chronically short on manpower. This desperation for dedicated professional soldiers gave rise to one of history's most famous and formidable organizations, the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. They were a bizarre and potent medieval hybrid part monk, part elite special forces. These men took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they also swore to defend the Holy Land with the sword. They answered only to the Pope, which made them incredibly powerful and independent, often acting as their own state within a state. The Knights Hospitaller, originally founded to care for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem, evolved into a crack fighting force while still maintaining their hospitals. They were the medics who could also break your legs. The Knights Templar, on the other hand, were established purely to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. They quickly became the elite shock troops of the Crusader army, feared for their discipline and ferocity in battle. They also, rather famously, became pioneers of international banking, which would eventually get them into a whole lot of trouble, but that's a story for later. These military orders were the backbone of the Crusader states' defense, the professional core in an army that often relied on temporary pilgrims and mercenaries. Now, you would think that being surrounded by hostile forces and vastly outnumbered would encourage a certain degree of unity among the Frankish lords. You would think they might put aside their petty squabbles for the greater good of survival. You would be adorably, hopelessly wrong. The internal politics of the Crusader states were a complete and utter mess. They had basically imported European feudalism, with all of its rivalries and inheritance drama, into the most volatile region on earth. Dukes, counts, and princes were constantly jockeying for power, prestige, and land. Alliances were made and broken with dizzying speed. There were succession crises where claimants would rather plunge their kingdom into civil war than let their second cousin take the throne. The Principality of Antioch was particularly notorious for being a thorn in everyone's side, often acting in its own interest rather than for the collective good of Outremer. The kings of Jerusalem, despite their prestigious title, often had a hell of a time trying to get the other rulers to actually listen to them. It was a chaotic soap opera of ambition, betrayal, and short-sighted greed. It's a miracle they lasted as long as they did. This constant infighting wasn't just a distraction, it was a critical weakness that their enemies would learn to exploit with surgical precision. And yet, life wasn't just one long, desperate battle. Amidst the political drama and military tension, a strange and unique culture began to emerge. The Franks, who were born in the Levant, known as Pulains, were a different breed from their European ancestors. They grew up in the eastern Mediterranean sun, and it changed them. For starters, they adopted many local customs out of sheer necessity and comfort. They wore lighter, more breathable clothing like the locals, rather than the heavy wools of Europe. Their diet incorporated local foods, lemons, apricots, sugar, and spices that were still exotic luxuries back home. They They even picked up the rather sensible Middle Eastern habit of bathing regularly, something their European cousins still viewed with suspicion. This cultural blending went beyond just food and hygiene. The Crusader states, particularly the coastal cities like Acre and Tyre, became bustling hubs of international trade. The Italian city-states, Genoa and Pisa, had a massive presence, their fleets carrying silks, spices, and other Eastern goods back to a hungry European market. This created a flow of not just goods, but ideas. Knowledge of science, medicine, and mathematics, largely preserved and advanced in the Islamic world, began to trickle back into Europe through these new ports. The Franks went to the Holy Land for God, but many of their Italian partners came along for gold, and that exchange had a profound long-term impact on the West. You can even see this fusion in their art and architecture. The churches they built weren't pure Romanesque copies of what they had back home. They incorporated elements of Byzantine design, with its ornate domes and mosaics, and even borrowed structural techniques and decorative motifs from Islamic architecture. It was a hybrid style, a visual representation of a world caught between East and West. It was a culture of adaptation, a testament to the fact that even in a situation defined by religious conflict, people still find ways to live, trade, and borrow from one another. But this fragile coexistence was always living on borrowed time. The Franks were settlers on a fault line, and the ground beneath their feet was beginning to shake. The initial success of the First Crusade was largely due to the fact that the Muslim world they encountered was politically fractured and disunited. The great Seljuk Empire was splintering, and local emirs and atabegs were more concerned with fighting each other than uniting against the invaders. The Crusaders didn't so much kick down the door as they walked through one that was already unlocked and slightly ajar. That, however, was not going to last. The presence of Christian-ruled states in the heart of what was considered Islamic land was an outrage, and slowly but surely, a countervailing force began to build. The concept of jihad, or holy struggle, was reinvigorated as a rallying cry for unity against the Frankish invaders. A powerful new leader emerged in the north, Imad al-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. Zengi was ruthless, ambitious, and a brilliant military commander. He saw the squabbling Crusader states, particularly the isolated county of Edessa, as a prime target. In 1144, while its count was away getting involved in yet another pointless feudal squabble, Zengi laid siege to the city of Edessa. After a brutal 4-week siege, the city fell. It was the first major Crusader city to be recaptured by Muslim forces. The news hit Europe like a thunderclap. The fall of Edessa shattered the illusion of Crusader invincibility. It was a terrifying reminder that their hold on the Holy Land was not a divine right, but a precarious military reality. It proved that a unified Muslim leader could not only challenge the Franks, but actually defeat them. The entire project was in jeopardy. The fort, which they had held for nearly half a century, was beginning to crumble. This single event would trigger a massive, panicked response from the West, sparking a whole new chapter in our story, the disastrous Second Crusade. So, the First Crusade, against all odds, actually worked. They took Jerusalem, carved out some new kingdoms, and were feeling pretty pleased with themselves. But here's the thing about building a kingdom in someone else's backyard: you have to hold it. The Crusader states, as they were called, were less like stable kingdoms and more like a collection of sandcastles built a little too close to a very angry tide. They were surrounded, undersupplied, and constantly squabbling among themselves. It was only a matter of time before one of them got washed away. That's exactly what happened in 1144. The city of Edessa, the northernmost and weakest of the Crusader states, was captured by a formidable Muslim leader named Imad al-Din Zengi. This wasn't just a minor setback, it was a 4-alarm fire. It was the first time a major Crusader city had fallen, and it sent a shockwave of panic all the way back to Europe. Naturally, the Pope at the time, Eugene III, decided it was time for a sequel. But this time, he wasn't just calling on the usual assortment of knights and nobles. No, this time he was bringing out the big guns. This would be a crusade of kings. To sell this new tour of the Holy Land, the Pope enlisted the biggest spiritual celebrity of the 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux. If you imagine a medieval rock star preacher, a man whose sermons could sell out stadiums and convince people to do just about anything, that was Bernard. He was the influencer's influencer, and his message was potent. He preached a storm across Europe, promising forgiveness of sins, heavenly glory, and a chance to do God's work. It was an intoxicating cocktail of piety and personal ambition, and two of the most powerful men in Europe drank it right up. First up was King Louis VII of France. Louis was a deeply pious man, but he was also carrying some heavy guilt. A few years earlier, during a conflict with one of his vassals, his army had set fire to a church in a town called Vitry, accidentally burning more than 1,000 people alive inside. For Louis, the crusade was less a strategic objective and more a personal pilgrimage of atonement. It was a chance to wash the ashes of Vitry from his soul. Then there was Conrad III, the King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor. Conrad was initially less than enthusiastic. He had his own problems at home, with rebellious nobles and a kingdom that was notoriously difficult to manage. He basically told Bernard, "Thanks, but I've got a lot on my plate right now." But Bernard of Clairvaux was not a man who took no for an answer. In a legendary sermon, he laid the guilt on thick, personally confronting Conrad and painting a vivid picture of him standing before Christ on Judgment Day, being asked what he had done for the faith. It was the ultimate divine peer pressure, and it worked. Conrad reluctantly agreed to take up the cross. So there you have it, the Second Crusade, the All-Star Edition. Two massive armies, led by two of Europe's most powerful kings, were heading to the Holy Land. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, literally everything. The entire affair was about to become a masterclass in how not to run a military campaign. The plan was for the two armies to travel separately and meet up in the Holy Land. Conrad and the Germans went first, marching overland through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire. This was the same route the First Crusaders had taken, but this time the welcome wagon was not out. The Byzantine Emperor, Manuel Komnenos, was deeply suspicious of these massive Western armies marching through his territory. He saw them not as allies, but as a horde of barely controlled fanatics who were just as likely to sack his cities as they were to fight the Turks. His solution was to hurry them through his lands as quickly as possible, selling them overpriced supplies and providing little to no support. Things went from bad to worse when Conrad's army crossed into Anatolia, which was Seljuk Turk territory. Conrad, brimming with misplaced confidence, split his army into two. He would lead the main force, consisting of his best knights, on a direct route across the Anatolian plateau. The other half, mostly civilian pilgrims, would take a safer coastal route. This was a catastrophic mistake. The Seljuks were masters of their own terrain. They didn't meet the Germans in a pitched battle, they just shadowed them, picking them off with hit-and-run cavalry attacks. The Crusaders were marching through a hot, arid landscape with dwindling supplies, no water, and a ghost-like enemy that bled them dry day after day. At a place called Dorylaeum, ironically, the site of a great First Crusade victory, the German army was finally cornered and decimated. A starving, dehydrated, and demoralized, Conrad had to face the humiliating truth his great army had been annihilated before it had even fought a single real battle. He and the tattered remnants of his forces limped back to Byzantine territory to wait for the French. Round 1 was a decisive loss. Meanwhile, Louis and the French army were following a few weeks behind, and they weren't faring much better. They also faced friction with the Byzantines and harassment from the Turks. Their own moment of spectacular failure came at a place called Mount Cadmus. The army was crossing a steep, wooded mountain pass. The vanguard, the front section of the army, pushed ahead and decided to set up camp for the night on the other side, assuming the rest of the army was right behind them. They were not. The main body of the army, with the king and all the baggage and pilgrims, had fallen far behind, stretched out and disorganized along the narrow path. The Turks, who had been watching the whole time, saw their opportunity. They swarmed down the mountainside, falling upon the scattered and vulnerable French column. It was a complete ambush. Knights were pulled from their horses, and pilgrims were slaughtered. The army disintegrated into a panicked mob. King Louis himself was nearly killed. According to the chroniclers, he was saved only by his anonymity. He wasn't wearing his royal regalia and his own skill, managing to climb a rock and fend off his attackers with his sword until nightfall. When the sun came up, the French had suffered devastating losses. Their morale was shattered, and like the Germans, they had been beaten without even reaching their objective. The survivors of both armies, a fraction of their original strength, finally rendezvoused in the Holy Land. You'd think the local Crusader lords would be happy to see them, but they were mostly horrified. These weren't the saviors they were hoping for. They were two beaten, demoralized kings with a remnant of an army and a whole lot of royal ego. Now came the question, what to do? The original objective, retaking Edessa, was quietly dropped. Edessa was a ruin, far to the north, and nobody had the strength or the will to march all the way up there. So, in the summer of 1148, the leaders held a grand meeting near the city of Acre to decide on a new target. This was the Council of Acre, the single most important and most idiotic decision of the entire crusade. The local barons, who had been living in the Levant for 2 generations, had their own ideas. They understood the complex political landscape. They knew who their enemies were, but more importantly, they knew who their enemies weren't. For years, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had maintained a fragile but functional alliance of convenience with the Muslim-ruled city of Damascus. Damascus was a major power, yes, but its rulers saw Zengi and his successor, Nur al-Din, as a much bigger threat than the Christians in Jerusalem. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as the saying goes. Jerusalem and Damascus had a common interest in keeping Nur al-Din from getting too powerful. Attacking Damascus would be like being in a street fight and deciding to punch your only bystander ally in the face. It made no sense. But the newly arrived European kings, Louis and Conrad, were having none of it. They hadn't come all this way, suffered all these losses, to engage in some complex diplomacy. They came to fight, and Damascus was rich, famous, and conveniently close. They wanted a glorious victory to justify this whole disastrous expedition. Against the better judgment of many of the local lords, the decision was made. The combined forces of the Second Crusade would attack Damascus. It was a strategic blunder of epic proportions, born from a mix of arrogance, ignorance, and a desperate need for a PR win. The siege began, and for a moment, it actually looked like it might work. The Crusaders attacked from the west, where the city was protected by dense orchards and gardens. These orchards provided them with food, water, and cover from the defenders on the walls. They pushed through the gardens and were on the verge of breaking into the city itself. And then, they made their second catastrophic mistake. For reasons that historians still argue about to this day, the Crusaders decided to abandon their advantageous position on the west and move their entire camp to the eastern side of the city. This side was a barren, waterless plain, and the city walls were much stronger and higher there. Why did they move? Some sources blame the local barons, suggesting they were bribed by the Damascenes or had their own secret plans to take the city for themselves. Others simply point to sheer, unadulterated incompetence on the part of the kings. Whatever the reason, it was the nail in the coffin of the Second Crusade. The moment they moved to the east, their fate was sealed. They were now exposed, with no food and no water. The defenders of Damascus, who had been on the verge of surrendering, were re-energized. Even better for them, news arrived that Nur al-Din, the very enemy Damascus and Jerusalem both feared, was on his way with a relief army. The Crusaders had not only failed to take the city, they had just invited their worst enemy to its doorstep. The siege fell apart in record time. The Crusader leaders started blaming each other. The local lords were furious at the European kings for their stupidity. Conrad and Louis were at each other's throats. Morale evaporated. After just 4 days, the siege was abandoned. The great Second Crusade, the Royal Crusade, slunk away in utter defeat. The aftermath was a toxic brew of humiliation and fury. Conrad and Louis went home in disgrace, their grand adventure having achieved less than nothing. The whole episode created a profound crisis of faith back in Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux had promised a victory willed by God. How could an army led by 2 kings, blessed by the Church's greatest preacher, fail so completely? Bernard, ever the spin doctor, came up with an answer: it wasn't God's will that was weak, but the Crusaders themselves. Their sins, their arrogance, their lack of faith, that was the cause of the failure. It was a convenient excuse, but the damage was done. The invincible aura of the crusading movement was gone. People began to question if God was really on their side after all. But the most devastating consequence was strategic. By attacking Damascus, the Crusaders had destroyed the delicate balance of power in the region. They had forced their only potential Muslim ally into the arms of their greatest enemy. Shortly after the Crusade, Damascus submitted to the rule of Nur al-Din, uniting Syria against the Crusader states. The Second Crusade didn't just fail to achieve its objective, it actively created the conditions for the downfall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It paved the way for a unified Islamic power to rise, a power that would soon be inherited by Nur al-Din's brilliant successor, a man who would unite Egypt and Syria and dedicate his life to driving the Crusaders into the sea. A man named Saladin. The kings had messed up. and in doing so, they had set the stage for a true clash of titans. So, while the Crusader states were busy with their internal soap opera, a new player was entering the game from the other side of the board, and he wasn't just any player, he was the type to flip the entire table over. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but history knows him better by the much catchier, one-word moniker Saladin. And he represents a fundamental shift in the entire story of the Crusades. Up until this point, the Crusader success, particularly in the First Crusade, was largely thanks to one glaring fact: the Muslim world was an absolute mess of rivalries and disunity. The Seljuk Empire was fractured, and you had competing caliphates in Baghdad and Cairo who despised each other. It was this division that the early Crusaders had exploited so brilliantly. They weren't fighting a monolithic Islamic empire, they were fighting a collection of city-states and petty rulers who were often just as happy to see their neighbors get sacked. But Saladin was about to change all of that. He didn't just see the Crusaders as an enemy, he saw the disunity of his own people as the core weakness that allowed the enemy to exist in their lands in the first place. Born into a prominent Kurdish military family, Saladin wasn't a king or a caliph by birth. He was, for lack of a better term, a career man. He learned his trade under his uncle Shirkuh, a general for the great Zengid ruler Nur al-Din. Their focus was initially on Egypt, the wealthy but politically decaying heartland of the Fatimid Caliphate. After a series of complex campaigns and political backstabbings that would make a fantastic TV series, Saladin found himself as the vizier of Egypt. And then, in a masterful political stroke, he abolished the Fatimid Caliphate entirely, realigning Egypt with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, at least in name. In reality, he was now the undisputed master of Egypt, its wealth, and its armies. When his old boss, Nur al-Din, died, a power vacuum opened up in Syria. Saladin, using a mix of diplomacy, popular appeal, and good old-fashioned military force, moved to fill it. This was his grand project to unite Muslim Egypt and Muslim Syria under a single ruler. It wasn't easy. He spent years putting out political fires, fighting off rival Muslim lords, and consolidating his power. But with every victory, his legend grew, as did his reputation for being not just a brilliant general, but also a just and pious ruler. He was building what the Crusaders had always feared: a unified Islamic front, stretching from North Africa to Mesopotamia, all pointed directly at the heart of their little kingdoms. The immovable object of the Crusader states was about to meet its unstoppable force. Now, let's turn our attention back to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was, to put it mildly, not having a great time. Their king, Baldwin I, the Leper King, was a genuinely remarkable and courageous figure, but he was dying from a horrific disease. This led to a vicious power struggle at court, a nest of vipers fighting over who would succeed him. On one side, you had the court party, a hawkish faction led by figures like the arrogant Guy of Lusignan and the downright villainous Raynald of Chatillon. Raynald is a character who almost feels like a caricature of a bloodthirsty, treaty-breaking rogue. He was the lord of the massive fortress of Kerak, which sat right alongside the vital trade and pilgrimage routes between Egypt and Syria. It was like putting a pirate fortress next to a major highway. Despite truces being in place, Raynald just couldn't help himself. He repeatedly raided Muslim caravans, stealing their goods, imprisoning their people, and generally being the worst possible neighbor. He even once tried to launch a naval raid on Mecca itself. Saladin had a very, very long list of grievances, and Raynald de Chatillon's name was at the top, underlined and circled in red. Every provocation by Raynald was another piece of propaganda Saladin could use to justify his coming holy war. On the other side of the Crusader court was the Nobles' Party, led by Raymond III of Tripoli. Raymond was a pragmatist. He understood the strategic reality the Crusader states were small and surrounded. Their survival depended on diplomacy and maintaining truces with their powerful neighbors, namely Saladin. For a while, Raymond's cautious approach held sway. But after Baldwin IV finally succumbed to his leprosy, the court party seized control. Guy of Lusignan was crowned king, and the Hawks were officially in charge of the asylum. The final straw came in late 1186 or early 1187. In flagrant violation of a truce, Reynaud de Chatillon attacked a massive, wealthy caravan traveling from Cairo. To add insult to injury, some reports claimed Saladin's own sister was in that caravan. That was it. The line had been crossed. Saladin had spent 2 decades unifying the Muslim world for this very moment. He declared jihad and summoned his forces from across his vast empire. The storm was about to break. He amassed the largest field army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever faced, a massive force of perhaps 30,000 soldiers, including 12,000 elite cavalry. In response, the Crusaders activated every single man they could, mustering a force of around 20,000, including their pride and joy, about 1,012 heavily armored knights. Saladin's strategy was a work of diabolical genius. He didn't just march on Jerusalem. Instead, he laid siege to the city of Tiberias, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He knew this was a trap, and he knew the Crusader psyche better than they knew it themselves. The city was held by none other than Raymond of Tripoli's wife. By attacking it, Saladin was personally baiting one of his main opponents, forcing the Crusader army to make a decision. King Guy held a war council. Raymond of Tripoli, the man who knew the terrain and the enemy, argued passionately against marching to relieve Tiberias. He said, "Let the city fall. I'll lose my wife and my lands, but the kingdom will be saved." He knew Saladin wanted them to come to him. The route from their camp to Tiberias was a long, dry, waterless march through the scorching summer heat. It was a suicide mission, and Raymond knew it. And for a moment, it seemed his counsel would prevail. Guy agreed it was too risky. But then, that night, Reynaud de Chatillon and the master of the Knights Templar went to the king's tent. They accused him of cowardice, of listening to a traitor. They played on his insecurities, and Guy of Lusignan, a man defined by his weakness and indecision, folded. He changed his mind and gave the order to march at dawn. It was the single worst military decision in the history of the Crusades. On July 3rd, 1187, the Crusader army set out. The sun beat down relentlessly. Saladin's horse archers, like wasps, swarmed their flanks, peppering them with arrows, melting away before any charge could reach them, and then returning to harass them again. The heat was suffocating. The men, clad in mail and heavy cloth, were dehydrating rapidly. Their water was gone. The infantry began to lag, and the disciplined cohesion of the army started to unravel under the constant stress and thirst. They were marching towards the Sea of Galilee, a massive body of fresh water they could see shimmering in the distance. But Saladin's army stood between them and it. He controlled the destination. That night, the Crusader army camped on a dry, arid plateau flanked by 2 hills known as the Horns of Hattin. They were surrounded, exhausted, and desperately thirsty. To add a bit of psychological torment, Saladin's men set fire to the dry brush, surrounding the Christian camp with smoke and flames all night. The next morning, July 4th, the battle began. But it was less of a battle and more of a foregone conclusion. The Crusader infantry, mad with thirst, broke ranks and tried to make a desperate push down the hill towards the water. They were cut down, and Raymond of Tripoli, seeing the hopelessness, led a charge that Saladin's men simply opened their ranks to let through. They let him escape, knowing he was no longer a threat, and closed ranks behind him, sealing the trap for good. The knights, clustered around King Guy and the holiest relic of the kingdom, a fragment of the true cross, made a few desperate, heroic, but ultimately futile charges up the hill. They were an island of defiance in a sea of victorious enemies. Eventually, exhausted and defeated, they collapsed. Their tents were captured, King Guy was taken prisoner, and worst of all, the true cross was lost. In one single, catastrophic day, the entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been annihilated. The aftermath was as telling as the battle itself. Saladin had the captured leaders brought to his tent. He was, as always, a gracious host. Seeing King Guy's thirst, he offered him a goblet of iced water. Guy drank, and then passed the goblet to Reynaud de Chatillon. But Saladin intervened, stating through an interpreter that it was Guy, not Saladin, who had given the man a drink. The laws of hospitality meant he would spare the king, but that protection did not extend to the man beside him. He then turned to Reynaud, the oathbreaker, the caravan raider, the man who had caused all of this. He offered him a chance to convert to Islam, which Reynaud refused. Saladin then drew his own sword and executed him on the spot. Promise made, promise kept. He also had the captured Knights Templar and Hospitaller executed. not out of simple cruelty, but because he saw them as fanatical military monks who could not be ransomed, as they would simply return to fight him another day. It was a brutal but calculated military decision. With the Crusader army gone, the kingdom was defenseless. Saladin swept through the land, capturing castle after castle, city after city. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, they all fell. Within months, only a handful of ports, including Tyre, remained in Christian hands. And then, he arrived at his ultimate prize, the holy city of Jerusalem. The city had been in Christian hands for 88 years, ever since the brutal massacre of the First Crusade. Everyone, both inside and outside the walls, expected a similar bloodbath. But Saladin was not the commander of the First Crusade. After a brief siege, the city's defender, Balian of Ibelin, another fascinating character, negotiated a surrender. Saladin agreed to spare the inhabitants. There would be no massacre, and Christian citizens were allowed to ransom themselves and leave peacefully. Those who couldn't afford the ransom were, by the standards of the day, supposed to become slaves. But Saladin and his brother, in an act of immense charity, paid the ransoms for thousands of them out of their own pockets and allowed them to leave. He allowed Christian pilgrimages to continue to the holy sites. He cleansed the mosques that had been converted into churches, but he respected the Christian holy places, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The contrast between his capture of Jerusalem in 1187 and the Crusaders' capture of it in 1099 could not be more stark. One was a disciplined, merciful, and strategic victory. The other was a chaotic and savage bloodbath. The fall of Jerusalem and the victory at Hattin sent shockwaves across Europe. It was an absolute cataclysm. The news would directly trigger the Third Crusade, bringing the most powerful kings of Christendom, including Richard the Lionheart, to the east. But for now, Saladin stood as the undisputed champion of the Muslim world. He had achieved what no one before him could. He had united his people, crushed his enemies in a battle for the ages, and reclaimed Jerusalem for Islam. And he had done it all with a combination of strategic brilliance, political savvy, and a sense of chivalry and mercy that would make him a legend, even to his enemies. The board was reset, and the game was about to enter its most famous chapter. Saladin had won the battle, but the war for the Holy Land was far from over, and a certain English king with a lion's heart was already packing his bags. So, the Crusader states are on the ropes. Jerusalem has fallen, and the great Saladin has effectively run the table on the Christian kingdoms. Back in Europe, the news lands with the force of a trebuchet stone to the gut. The Pope, probably after a few deep, papal sighs, issues a call for another crusade. But this isn't just going to be another round of nobles looking for glory. Oh no. This time, they're sending in the big guns, the kings. This was meant to be the Avengers of medieval Christendom, the ultimate royal super team assembled to take back the Holy Land. In one corner, you had Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was the seasoned veteran, the Captain America of the group, with a massive, disciplined army and decades of experience. He was so powerful, in fact, that Saladin was reportedly more worried about him than anyone else. In the other corner, you had the ultimate frenemies of the 12th century, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart. Philip was the schemer, the politician. He was playing a long game, and the crusade was just one move on a much larger chessboard that mostly involved consolidating his power back in France, preferably at Richard's expense. And then there was Richard. He wasn't just a king, he was a rock star, a warrior celebrity. He'd spent most of his life fighting, not ruling, and he saw the crusade as the ultimate stage for his talents. He was a brilliant general and a fearsome fighter, but also arrogant, hot-tempered, and far more interested in personal glory than in the boring day-to-day business of being a monarch. To him, England was less a kingdom to be nurtured and more a piggy bank to be smashed open for this grand adventure. So, the stage is set for an epic comeback story. The three most powerful kings in Europe are on their way. What could possibly go wrong? Well, for starters, the super team began to fall apart before they even got to the main event. Frederick Barbarossa, after marching his immense army all the way across Europe and Anatolia with formidable discipline, decided to take a bath in a river in modern-day Turkey, and then he just drowned. Just like that. The most powerful man in Europe, leader of the largest army, taken out by a poorly timed swim. His massive army, leaderless and demoralized, mostly disintegrated. So much for the German contribution. This left Richard and Philip who probably weren't too broken up about Frederick's demise. Their journey to the Holy Land was a masterclass in passive aggression. They sailed together, but they were constantly bickering, posturing, and undermining each other. Richard, being Richard, couldn't resist a bit of side questing. He stopped off in Sicily to bully his own brother-in-law, and then casually conquered the island of Cyprus, just to make sure everyone knew who the main character was. Philip just watched, stewing, and probably updating his mental list of all the ways he was going to get back at Richard later. When they finally arrived in the Holy Land, the situation was centered on the port city of Acre. The remnants of the Crusader armies had been besieging the well-defended Muslim garrison there for nearly 2 years. It was a miserable, grinding stalemate. The Christian camp was a cesspool of disease and starvation, and the Muslim defenders were equally exhausted. It was a meat grinder, chewing up soldiers from both sides with brutal efficiency. Richard's arrival was like a shot of adrenaline. He brought fresh troops, money, and most importantly, his expertise in siege warfare. He set up massive siege engines, which he theatrically named Bad Neighbor and God's Own Catapult, and began to systematically pound the city's walls into dust. The combined pressure was too much. After a long and bloody struggle, the garrison at Acre finally surrendered. The first major victory for the Third Crusade was won. But this is where the romantic legend of Richard the Lionheart gets a dark and bloody footnote. Part of the surrender agreement involved Saladin paying a large sum and returning a piece of the True Cross. When Saladin was slow to make the payment, Richard lost his patience. In a move of shocking brutality, he ordered nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children, to be marched outside the city and publicly executed. It was a cold, calculated act of terror designed to send a message. The chivalrous knight of legend was also capable of being an absolute monster. Even the other crusaders were reportedly horrified. Philip, having had enough of the heat, the fighting, and especially Richard, decided this was a good time to go home. He pledged he wouldn't attack Richard's lands, a promise he had absolutely no intention of keeping, and sailed back to France, leaving Richard as the sole commander of the crusade. Now in charge, Richard knew he had one objective: Jerusalem. But to get there, he had to march his army south along the coast. Saladin, a master of strategy, wasn't going to give him a pitched battle. Instead, he shadowed Richard's army, his horse archers constantly harassing the Crusader column. It was a death march under a blazing sun. Men were dying of heat stroke, and from the constant rain of arrows. It took incredible discipline to keep the Crusader army from breaking formation and charging into a trap. Richard was everywhere, riding up and down the lines, keeping his men in a tight, disciplined block. He was a general in his element. The lion was leading his pride through a sea of wolves. The inevitable clash came near the town of Arsuf. After weeks of goading and skirmishing, Saladin finally committed to a full-scale attack. For hours, the Crusaders endured the onslaught, a storm of arrows and cavalry charges. Richard held his nerve, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, when he saw Saladin's forces were committed and slightly disorganized, he gave the signal. The disciplined Crusader knights, coiled like a spring, unleashed a devastating charge that shattered Saladin's army. It wasn't a total annihilation, but it was a clear, tactical victory for Richard. He had proven he could beat Saladin in an open battle. This conflict wasn't just fought with swords and arrows, it was also a battle of wits and reputation. A strange sort of mutual respect grew between the two leaders. The legend goes that when Richard fell ill with a fever, Saladin sent him fresh peaches and snow from the mountains to cool him down. Another story claims that when Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 fresh mounts, saying it was not right for a king to fight on foot. How much of this is true is debatable, but it speaks to a shared code of chivalry. It was a bizarre professional courtesy between 2 men who were, for all intents and purposes, the world's biggest rivals locked in a holy war. They were legends aware of each other's legendary status. After his victory at Arsuf, Richard captured the port of Jaffa and began to prepare for the final push. He marched his army inland up into the hills of Judea. They were getting closer, so close, in fact, that his scouts could see the walls of Jerusalem. This was it. The moment everything had been building towards. The entire purpose of this multi-year, incredibly costly, and bloody expedition was within his grasp. And then, he turned back. Why? Why would the great Lionheart, the peerless warrior, get to the 5-yard line and then decide not to score? because Richard, the brilliant general, overruled Richard, the zealous crusader. He knew that even if he could take Jerusalem, which was a big whiff, he couldn't possibly hold it. His supply lines were stretched thin, Saladin's main army was still intact, and as soon as he left for England, which he desperately needed to do, as his brother John and the French King Philip were busily carving up his kingdom, the city would be lost again. It was a bitter, pragmatic pill to swallow. The ultimate prize was a strategic trap. The holy warrior had to make a decision with his head, not his heart. Capturing the city would be a hollow victory, a moment of glory followed by an inevitable and embarrassing defeat. So he made the sensible choice. The crusade, which had begun with so much royal fanfare, would not end with a climactic battle for the holy city. It would end, like so many modern conflicts, at the negotiating table. After more skirmishes and a lot of back and forth, Richard and Saladin finally agreed to a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but was better than continued bloodshed. The Crusader states would hold a narrow strip of coastline from Acre to Jaffa. Critically, Christian pilgrims would be granted safe and unarmed access to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. It was a practical solution, but it felt deeply anticlimactic. Richard, the Lionheart, the legend, had come all this way not to conquer the Holy Land, but to negotiate visiting rights. On his way home, his luck finally ran out. He was shipwrecked, captured by a rival duke, and held for a massive ransom that nearly bankrupted England to pay. So much for a glorious homecoming. The Third Crusade was over. It had saved the Crusader presence in the Levant from total extinction, but had utterly failed in its primary objective of retaking Jerusalem. It was a crusade of legendary figures, titanic clashes, and incredible expense. And yet, for all the blood, treasure, and royal power poured into it, the result was a stalemate. It left behind a powerful legend, a shaky truce, and a host of lingering questions about the true nature of holy war, and whether the glory of a single man is worth the price of a kingdom. Alright, let's talk about the Fourth Crusade. If the First Crusade was a shockingly violent, yet surprisingly successful holy mission, and the Third was a blockbuster showdown between two legendary figures, the Fourth was, well, it was the episode where the writers got drunk, threw the script in a fire, and decided to just improvise the most chaotic, cynical, and self-destructive plot twist imaginable. This is the story of how a holy war against the enemies of Christ somehow, through a series of terrible decisions, ended with an army of Christian knights sacking the biggest Christian city in the world. It's a masterclass in how greed, ambition, and a complete lack of cash can derail even the most sacred of undertakings. So buckle up, because this one gets weird, ugly, and profoundly stupid. Our story begins, as many of these do, with a pope. This time, it's Pope Innocent III, a man who was arguably one of the most powerful and politically savvy popes in history. Around 1202, he looked at the situation in the Holy Land and decided it was time for another go. He was ambitious, he was influential, and he called for a new crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. But this time, there was a twist in the plan, a genuinely clever one. Instead of marching overland through Anatolia, which had proven to be a logistical nightmare, or sailing directly to the Crusader ports, they would strike at the heart of the enemy's power, Egypt. This was the center of the Ayyubid Sultanate, the dynasty founded by Saladin. Taking Egypt would cripple their resources and make holding Jerusalem infinitely easier. A smart plan, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, for starters, to invade Egypt by sea, you need ships. A lot of ships. More ships than any single king could muster. So the Crusader leadership did the only logical thing: they went shopping. And in the 13th century, if you wanted a navy, you went to Venice. And Venice wasn't just a city, it was a maritime corporation with a flag. They were the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, and their business was business. The Crusaders, led by a group of French nobles, approached the legendary Doge of Venice, a man named Enrico Dandolo. Dandolo was, and this is not an exaggeration, over 90 years old and blind, but his mind was as sharp and ruthless as a shard of glass. The Crusaders asked Dandolo for a fleet capable of transporting 3,300 men hundred and 4,500 horses, a massive undertaking. The Doge and the Venetians, smelling a historic payday, agreed. They quoted a price of 85,000 silver marks, a truly astronomical sum. They also agreed to provide 50 warships of their own on the condition that they would receive half of all conquered territory and loot. See? Business. The Venetians, in a city-wide effort, put all other work on hold, and built this magnificent fleet. It was a marvel of logistics and engineering, and in the summer of 1202, the Crusaders began to trickle into Venice to meet their brand new, very expensive rides. The only problem was, not enough of them showed up. Instead of the projected 33,500 soldiers, only about 12,000 actually made it to Venice. It was a classic case of overpromising and underdelivering. Many Crusaders had decided to make their own way or simply never left home. This left the leaders with a huge problem. They had a fleet built for an army 3 times their size, and they were nowhere close to having the 85,000 silver marks they owed. They managed to scrape together about 51,000 marks, but that still left them deep in debt. The Venetians were in a bind too. Their entire economy had been geared towards this project for a year. They had a massive, idle fleet clogging their harbour and a bunch of heavily armed, unemployed knights camping on their doorstep. Doge Dandolo was not about to let them just walk away from the bill. He was a businessman, and these were terrible business partners. So, the cunning, blind old Doge came up with what you might call a creative financing solution. He made the Crusaders an offer. He told them he would defer their debt. Vifac they helped the Venetians with a little pest control. The nearby port city of Zara, on the Dalmatian coast, had rebelled against Venetian authority. It was a commercial rival and a political thorn in their side. There was just one tiny, insignificant little detail. Zara was a Christian city. Not only that, its overlord was the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the Crusader vow and was therefore technically under the protection of the Pope. This wasn't a detour, it was a betrayal of the entire point of the mission. The Pope explicitly forbade it. A significant number of Crusaders were horrified by the idea, attacking fellow Christians. This wasn't what they signed up for. Some refused and went home, but most were trapped. They were stuck in Venice, in debt up to their eyeballs, and this was the only way out offered to them. With heavy hearts and against papal orders, the Fourth Crusade set sail for another Christian city. The siege of Zara in 1202 was a grim affair. Crusaders fought against other Christians who had hung banners with crosses on their walls to show their shared faith. The city fell, and it was brutally sacked. When Pope Innocent III heard the news, he was furious. He excommunicated the entire crusade, Venetians included. The holy mission was now officially a cursed one. But just when you think this story can't get any more convoluted, a new character enters the stage. While the Crusaders were wintering in the conquered city of Zara, they were approached by a young man named Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince with a very tempting offer. Here's the backstory. Young Alexios' father, Emperor Isaac II Angelos, had been overthrown, blinded, and imprisoned by his own brother, who was now ruling in Constantinople as Emperor Alexios III. It was your standard, run-of-the-mill Byzantine family drama. Young Alexios had escaped and was touring Europe trying to find someone, anyone, with an army to help him reclaim his father's throne. And in the disgraced, excommunicated, and very broke army of the Fourth Crusade, he found the perfect pawns. He made them an offer that was, frankly, too good to be true. He promised that if they diverted to Constantinople and put him and his father back on the throne, he would pay off their entire debt to the Venetians. But wait, there's more. He also promised to give them an extra 200,000 silver marks for their trouble, provide their crusade with 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the invasion of Egypt, and pay to maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land for life. And the final, glittering cherry on top for the Pope, he promised to end the Great Schism and place the entire Eastern Orthodox Church under the authority of Rome. It was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. The Crusader leadership, especially the Venetians who had old grudges and new commercial ambitions against the Byzantines, saw their chance. They could clear their names, pay their debts, and get a new, powerful ally for their holy war. They convinced the grumbling soldiers that this was all part of God's mysterious plan. The excommunication was quietly lifted for the Crusaders, but not the Venetians, and the fleet turned its prows toward Constantinople. In the summer of 1203, the citizens of Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, the largest and wealthiest metropolis in all of Christendom, woke up to the sight of a massive Crusader fleet in their harbour. They weren't there as allies or pilgrims, they were there as a tool of regime change, hired by a claimant to the throne. The city was a fortress, protected by the legendary Theodosian walls on land and massive sea walls. But the ruling usurper, Alexios III, was a spectacularly incompetent leader. After a surprisingly brief siege, during which the blind 90-something Doge Dandolo personally led the Venetian forces from the front of his galley, Alexios III panicked, grabbed a bunch of treasure, and fled the city. And just like that, it worked. The gates were opened, the blinded old Emperor Isaac II was released from his dungeon, and he was recrowned alongside his son, who became Emperor Alexios IV. The Crusaders had done it. They had fulfilled their contract. Now all they had to do was sit back and wait for the massive pile of silver they were promised. Except, there was no massive pile of silver. The young, newly crowned Alexios IV quickly discovered that his usurping uncle had already fled with most of the treasury. The imperial coffers were empty. The new emperor was in the horrifying position of having written a check his empire couldn't cash, with a very large, very well-armed collection agency camped just outside his walls. He tried his best. He melted down precious church icons and artifacts for their gold and silver, a move that made him deeply unpopular with his own people. The citizens of Constantinople, who had never liked the Latins to begin with, now saw them as greedy leeches being paid with the city's sacred heritage. Tensions simmered and then boiled over. Fights broke out. A fire, accidentally started by Crusaders, raged through the city for days, leaving thousands homeless. The people of Constantinople had enough. In early 1204, a popular uprising stormed the palace. They deposed Alexios IV and his father, and this time, there was no escape. Young Alexios was strangled in a dungeon. A new, fiercely anti-Latin emperor was put on the throne. The Crusaders' meal ticket had just been violently punched. They were now stranded deep in hostile territory, with no money, no supplies, and no way to get to the Holy Land. The leadership, driven by a toxic cocktail of desperation, rage, and pure, unadulterated greed, made a decision. If they couldn't get paid by the emperor, they would pay themselves with the city. The new plan was simple and utterly monstrous. They would take Constantinople for themselves. They drew up a formal treaty, the Partitio Romaniae, on how they would divide the spoils of the Byzantine Empire before they had even captured it. On April 12, 1204, the Fourth Crusade launched its final, fatal assault on the walls of Constantinople. This time, they succeeded. What followed was one of the most disgraceful and horrific events in medieval history. The city was subjected to 3 days of systematic pillaging and slaughter, an orgy of destruction that beggars belief. This was not the usual chaos of a medieval siege. This was the deliberate dismantling of a civilization. The Venetians, connoisseurs of art and wealth, knew exactly what to take, snatching up priceless relics, jewels, and manuscripts. The famous bronze horses that now adorn St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, stolen from the Hippodrome of Constantinople. The Crusader Knights, supposedly warriors of Christ, ran amok. They desecrated the Hagia Sophia, the grandest church in Christendom, drinking from its sacred chalices and placing a prostitute on the patriarch's throne. They smashed ancient statues, burned libraries filled with irreplaceable knowledge from the classical world, and murdered civilians indiscriminately. They violated their holy mission in every conceivable way. When the dust settled, the shining city of Constantinople was a smoldering ruin. The Byzantine Empire was shattered. The Crusaders followed through on their cynical treaty, carving up the empire's lands. They elected one of their own, Baldwin of Flanders, as the new Latin Emperor of Constantinople. The Venetians claimed the most valuable prize control of 3/8 of the empire, including key ports and islands that cemented their commercial dominance for a century. The Fourth Crusade never reached Egypt. It never fought a single soldier of the Ayyubid Sultanate. Instead, it had dealt a mortal blow to a fellow Christian empire, a bastion that had shielded Europe from Eastern invaders for centuries. It permanently poisoned the relationship between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, creating a bitterness that lingers to this day. It was, in short, a complete and utter catastrophe. It exposed the rot that had crept into the crusading ideal, showing how piety could be a thin veneer for political ambition and avarice. The holy cause was corrupted, perhaps irrevocably, and from here, the story of the Crusades only gets stranger and sadder. After the celebrity deathmatch of the Third Crusade, and the absolute fiasco of the Fourth, you'd think Europe would have shelved the whole crusading concept, maybe put it in a drawer next to leech-based medicine and the belief that the earth was the center of everything. But you'd be wrong. The idea of crusading, much like a terrible pop song, was just too catchy to die. It had become less of a focused military objective and more of a habit. A very violent, very expensive, and increasingly pointless habit. The fire that Pope Urban II had lit centuries ago hadn't been extinguished. Instead, it had just been left to smolder, occasionally flaring up in weird and embarrassing ways, like a backyard barbecue that no one has the heart to put out. Welcome to the later Crusades, the era of lost causes and diminishing returns. This brings us to the Fifth Crusade, which kicked off in the early 13th century. The game plan had changed slightly. Instead of a direct, head-on assault on Jerusalem, the new strategy was to hit the Ayyubid Sultanate in Egypt. The logic was surprisingly sound to take out the enemy's powerhouse, and the rest of their territory, including the Holy Land, would be easier to snag. Think of it as trying to win a video game, by going straight for the final boss's castle, instead of grinding through all the lower levels. It was ambitious, and for a moment, it almost seemed to work. A massive Crusader army landed in Egypt, and after a long and brutal siege, actually managed to capture the vital port city of Damietta. Things were looking up. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, was so worried that he made an incredible offer. He would trade Jerusalem and a huge chunk of the former Crusader kingdom back to the Christians in exchange for them just leaving Egypt. This was it. This was the dream deal, the grand prize they had been fighting and dying for. So, naturally, they said no. Why? Because of one man, Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate. Pelagius, convinced that total victory was just around the corner and that any deal with a Muslim leader was a deal with the devil, vetoed the entire thing. He believed God would deliver them a complete victory. Spoiler alert, God did not. Emboldened by Pelagius's supreme overconfidence, the Crusader army marched on Cairo, deeper into enemy territory, during the annual Nile flood season. It was, to put it mildly, a terrible idea. The Nile flooded, their supply lines were cut, and the entire invincible army was trapped, starving, and surrounded. Al-Kamil, the very sultan whose generous offer they had spat on, now had them completely at his mercy. In a move of remarkable grace, he didn't slaughter them. He just fed the starving army and then sent them packing, in exchange for getting Damietta back. The Fifth Crusade ended not with a bang, but with a humiliating, waterlogged whimper. If the Fifth Crusade was a story of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, the Sixth Crusade was something else entirely. It was the weird, semi-successful excommunicated sequel that no one saw coming, and it starred one of the most fascinating figures of the Middle Ages Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. And Frederick was different. He spoke 6 languages, including Arabic. He was a patron of science and art. He kept a menagerie of exotic animals, and, most scandalously, he actually respected Muslim culture and preferred to negotiate rather than fight. To the Pope, he was basically the Antichrist with a crown. Frederick had promised to go on crusade for years, but kept putting it off for political reasons, earning him excommunication from the Pope. So what does he do? He finally goes on crusade, while still excommunicated. This created the wonderfully bizarre situation of the leader of a crusade being officially condemned by the church that sponsored it. When Frederick and his army arrived in the Holy Land, he didn't immediately start sharpening his sword. Instead, he opened a dialogue with the very same Sultan al-Kamil from the Fifth Crusade. The two of them were intellectuals, worldly and pragmatic, and they found they had a lot to talk about. After a bit of posturing and a lot of surprisingly friendly negotiation, they hammered out a treaty. Al-Kamil, who had his own political problems, agreed to hand over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. The city would be demilitarized and Muslims would retain control over the Temple Mount. It was a diplomatic masterstroke. Frederick had achieved through talking what kings and cardinals had failed to do with decades of bloodshed. He walked into Jerusalem and crowned himself its king. He had won the Holy City back without a single major battle, and for this, the Pope and the local clergy hated him. They placed Jerusalem under an interdict, essentially excommunicating the entire city. Think about that. The goal of the Crusades for over a century had been to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity. Frederick II does it, and the church's official reaction is to shun the city and everyone in it because they didn't approve of how he did it. The ideal of holy war was now so twisted that a peaceful victory was seen as a failure, because Jerusalem wouldn't stay in Christian hands for long anyway. The political situation was too volatile, and a decade later, the city was sacked by Khwarezmian mercenaries, rendering Frederick's diplomatic victory moot. The age of strange, individualistic crusades was over, and the age of the national vanity project was about to begin. And enter King Louis IX of France, later known as Saint Louis. If Frederick II was a cynical pragmatist, Louis was his polar opposite. He was devout, pious, and deeply, truly believed in the crusading ideal with every fibre of his being. And that's what made him so dangerous. His sincerity led him to orchestrate two of the most catastrophic crusades in history. The Seventh Crusade was Louis's first attempt, and it was essentially a bigger, more expensive, and even more disastrous repeat of the Fifth Crusade. Once again, the target was Egypt. Once again, the Crusaders captured Damietta. And once again, they made a boneheaded decision to march on the interior. This time, they were met by the elite Mamluk warriors, who were a whole different class of soldier. The French army, led by Louis himself, was utterly crushed at the Battle of Al-Mansoura. Louis was captured, along with most of his army. The King of France, the most powerful monarch in Europe, was a prisoner of war. To get him back, France had to pay a ransom so enormous it nearly bankrupted the entire kingdom. They also had to give back Damietta, the only thing they had accomplished. It was an absolute humiliation on a national scale. Most leaders would have learned their lesson. But not Louis. His faith was unshaken. He was convinced the failure wasn't due to bad strategy or the formidable Mamluk army. No, it was because of the sinfulness of the people. So he spent the next 20 years becoming an even more pious king, preparing for his redemption, his grand return. This led to the Eighth Crusade. This time, for reasons that still baffle historians, Louis decided to attack Tunis in North Africa. The supposed logic was that the Emir of Tunis was on the verge of converting to Christianity, and a little military encouragement would seal the deal. This was, of course, complete fantasy. The Crusader army landed on the shores of Carthage in the blistering heat of summer. Almost immediately, disease tore through the camp. Dysentery, likely caused by contaminated water, ran rampant. And soon it claimed the life of King Louis IX himself. The saintly king died in his tent, on a bed of ashes, reportedly whispering the name Jerusalem. His death effectively ended the crusade. The army, leaderless and decimated by sickness, packed up and went home. Louis's crusade accomplished nothing except getting himself killed and earning him sainthood for his trouble. It was a tragic, pointless end for a man whose sincere faith led only to disaster. It was also the last major crusade to the east. While all this was happening in the Holy Land, the very concept of the crusade was being diluted back in Europe. Popes had realized that the Holy War was a pretty effective tool for dealing with their political enemies closer to home. You had the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, a brutal affair that was more about crushing a rival Christian sect and consolidating royal power than anything else. Then there were the Northern Crusades, where Teutonic knights waged war against pagan tribes in the Baltic. The label Crusade was now a franchise, a stamp of approval that could be applied to any military campaign that served the interests of the papacy or a powerful Catholic monarch. The original mission was all but forgotten. The last gasp, the final, sputtering ember of the original crusading movement, is what's sometimes called the Ninth Crusade. It was less of a full crusade and more of a glorified armed pilgrimage led by Prince Edward of England, the future King Edward I. He arrived in the Holy Land shortly after Louis IX died and found the situation hopeless. He managed to win a few minor skirmishes and secure a truce, but it was like trying to patch up a sinking ship with chewing gum. The Crusader states were crumbling, surrounded by the ever-growing power of the Mamluk Sultanate. Edward eventually went home to become king, and the fate of the last Christian strongholds was sealed. The end came in 1291 at the city of Acre, the last capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil arrived with one of the largest armies ever seen in the Levant, equipped with massive siege engines. The defenders of Acre, a motley collection of Templars, Hospitallers, and local barons, were hopelessly outnumbered. What followed was a desperate, heroic, and utterly brutal last stand. For weeks, the city held out against a relentless bombardment, but the walls were eventually breached. The Mamluks poured into the city, and a horrific slaughter ensued. The age of the Crusades in the Holy Land was over. The fire that had burned for 2 centuries, that had consumed countless lives and fortunes, that had reshaped empires and defined an era, had finally faded to black. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem was dead, and the last of its defenders were dead with it. The great, bloody, and ultimately futile experiment was finished. The later Crusades tell a story of entropy. They show an idea that was once powerful enough to move armies across the known world, slowly losing its meaning. It became a political tool, a king's obsession, a ghost that haunted Europe for a few more decades before finally vanishing, leaving behind only ruins, recriminations, and a deeply complicated legacy. If the long, bloody history of the Crusades is a story about faith, ambition, and unintended consequences, then we have now arrived at its most deeply unsettling and profoundly tragic chapter. It's a story that feels less like a historical event and more like a dark fairy tale, a cautionary tale whispered through the centuries. This is the part of the saga where the adults, having repeatedly failed to achieve their holy objectives through violence and politics, effectively step aside. And into that void walks a new kind of army, one fueled by a terrifying, unshakable purity. We're talking about the so-called Children's Crusade of 1212. And I say 92% for a very good reason. Modern historians look at this event with a heavy dose of skepticism, not about its tragedy, but about its details. The classic story you might have heard is one of literal armies of children, tens of thousands strong, marching to reclaim the Holy Land, with innocence as their only weapon. The reality, as is so often the case, is probably a lot murkier and, frankly, even more depressing. The term for it, in Latin, peregrinatio puerorum, doesn't necessarily mean children's crusade, pure, could mean boy, but it was also a term used for the landless poor, the pauperes. This wasn't necessarily an army of 5-year-olds, but more likely a mass movement of destitute peasants, adolescents, and the dispossessed. But, let's be clear, many of them fifth children, caught up in a wave of religious fervor that promised an escape from the bleak, hopeless reality of their lives. It was a mass pilgrimage of the desperate, and its story unfolds in two distinct, equally heartbreaking movements. Our first story begins in France, with a young shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes. According to the chronicles, Stephen claimed to have a letter for the French king, a letter he said was delivered to him by Jesus Christ himself. You have to imagine the scene. Here is this charismatic, wide-eyed boy, possibly no older than 12, standing in a field, preaching with a conviction that most seasoned priests could only dream of. His message was simple, powerful, and dangerously naive. He preached that the sinfulness of adult crusaders was why they had failed. Their greed, their violence, their politics, it all offended God. But the innocent, he claimed, the pure of heart, they would succeed where knights and kings had failed. His plan was as simple as it was magical. He would march his followers to the Mediterranean Sea, and God, seeing their purity, would part the waters for them, just as he had for Moses. They would walk on dry land all the way to Jerusalem. It's a powerful image, and it spread like wildfire. Thousands were drawn to his call. These weren't soldiers, they were the poor, the young, the hopeful. They were people with nothing left to lose, who saw in Stephen's vision a divine escape route from a life of grinding poverty. Imagine being a parent in a drafty hovel, watching your children slowly starve. Then you hear of a boy prophet, sent by Jesus, who promises a miracle. It's easy for us, from our comfortable future, to scoff, but for them, it was the only glimmer of hope in a world of darkness. So they followed him. An enormous procession, estimated by some chroniclers to be as large as 30,000 people, began a long, painful march south towards the port of Marseille. They carried crosses, sang hymns, and truly believed a miracle was waiting for them. The journey itself was a brutal filter. They had no supply lines, no logistical support. They marched through the French countryside, relying on the charity of others for food and shelter. Many, especially the youngest, never even made it out of France. They succumbed to starvation, disease, and exhaustion along the way. Can you just picture it? The initial fervor and joyful singing slowly giving way to the harsh reality of the road, the weakening bodies, the growing fear, the quiet burials in unmarked graves, and all the while, the unwavering belief that the sea must part. When Stephen and his vastly diminished group of followers finally arrived in Marseille, they stood at the edge of the water. They waited, they prayed, they sang their hymns, and the sea, indifferent to their faith and their suffering, did absolutely nothing. It just remained the sea. The crushing disappointment must have been absolute. The divine promise, the entire foundation of their journey, had proven false. Some turned back, attempting the long, shameful walk home. Others simply stayed, destitute and lost, in a major port city. But for many, the story gets even darker. Two local merchants, with names that have been preserved by history as a special mark of infamy, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, stepped forward with an offer. It was a lie wrapped in kindness. They told the desperate children that they were pious men, moved by their faith, and would provide ships to carry them to the Holy Land, free of charge. It was the miracle they had been waiting for, just in a different form. A wave of relief must have washed over the camp. 7 ships were loaded with the remaining followers of Stephen of Cloyes. They set sail from the harbour, their hopes reignited, believing they were finally on their way to Palestine. They were not. 2 of the ships were wrecked in a storm off the coast of Sardinia, drowning everyone on board. The other 5 ships, however, continued their journey, not to the Holy Land, but to the coasts of North Africa. If Hugh the Iron and William the Pig had made a deal. They sailed the children to Bougie in Alexandria, where every last one of them was sold into slavery. The pure-hearted Crusaders ended their journey not in Jerusalem, but in the slave markets of the Saracens they had set out to convert. It was a betrayal so complete, so profoundly cynical, it's hard to comprehend. And as this tragedy was unfolding in France, a second, eerily similar movement was happening in Germany. This one was led by another boy, Nicholas of Cologne. He was even younger than Stephen, perhaps 10 years old. Nicholas's message was almost identical. He preached that the innocent would reclaim the Holy Land. He, too, promised a miracle the Mediterranean would part for his followers, allowing them to walk to their destination. He even added his own flourish, claiming the sea would be dry, but the land of the Holy Land would be fertile and converted once they arrived. He gathered his own massive following, perhaps 20,000 strong or more, and began his own march. But his path was even more punishing than Stephen's. His plan was to march south, over the Alps, and into Italy to find a port. Think about that for a moment. An army of peasants and children, ill-equipped, underfed, attempting to cross one of the most formidable mountain ranges in the world. They travelled in 2 groups, one heading towards Genoa, the other towards Pisa. The journey over the Alps was an apocalypse. Thousands died from the cold, from starvation, from falling off treacherous mountain passes. They were preyed upon by wolves and by people who saw them as nothing more than an opportunity for theft. The chronicles speak of skeletons littering the mountain trails for years to come. When one of the groups, led by Nicholas himself, finally stumbled out of the mountains and into the city of Genoa, they were a shadow of their former selves. Exhausted, emaciated, and stunned, they presented themselves to the city's rulers, and once again they marched to the sea, fully expecting it to part. And once again it did not. The city of Genoa, practical and unsentimental, was less than welcoming. They saw not a holy army, but a swarm of starving vagrants. They gave them a choice: settle here and become citizens, or leave. Many were simply too broken to continue. Nicholas, however, was undeterred. He gathered what was left of his followers and continued the march down the Italian coast to the city of Pisa. Here, the story repeats itself with a slightly different twist. In Pisa, 2 ships were found that agreed to take some of the children to Palestine. And that's it. The ships sail over the horizon, and the chronicles simply fall silent. We have no idea what happened to them. They were never heard from again. Did they drown in a storm? Were they sold into slavery? We just don't know. Their fate is a historical blank space. But Nicholas still wasn't done. He and the last remnant of his original army continued their march, all the way to Rome itself. They had walked from the Rhineland, over the Alps, down the entire length of Italy. By the time they reached the heart of Christendom, they were utterly broken. There, they met Pope Innocent III. He was, by all accounts, moved by their plight, but also horrified. He saw the tragic naivety of their cause, and officially put an end to it. He absolved them of their crusading vows and gently, sorrowfully, told them to go home. Go home. For the few hundred who remained from an army of 20,000, this was a devastating command. Many had no homes to return to. They were orphans, the landless, the forgotten. Their miracle had failed, their journey was over, and they were simply left to disperse and disappear. Very few ever made it back to Germany. Nicholas himself is never heard from again. He vanishes from the historical record, a boy prophet who led thousands to their deaths on the back of a catastrophic, heartfelt delusion. His story, and Stephen's story, serves as a testament to an age brimming with a kind of faith that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. It was a faith that was desperate, fierce, and untempered by reason. It was a faith that could lead a shepherd boy to believe he was a prophet, and thousands of desperate people to believe the sea would bend to their will. The Children's Crusade wasn't a crusade in any military sense. It was a social and religious phenomenon. It was a rebellion of the powerless, a mass pilgrimage born from the collision of apocalyptic belief and profound social misery. And in the end, it stands as perhaps the most painful proof of the Crusade's moral and spiritual bankruptcy, when the ideals of a holy war have curdled so much that they can be twisted to send thousands of children to their deaths. What is even left of the original idea? It's a haunting question, and it marks a turning point, not in the wars themselves, but in the soul of the entire crusading movement. And so, our long, winding journey through centuries of, well, let's call it enthusiastic pilgrimage, finally comes to a close. We've travelled a long and bloody road together tonight, from a pope's grand idea in a field in France to the last lonely fort falling on the shores of the Levant. We started with Pope Urban II's grand sales pitch at Clermont, a call to arms so potent it unleashed a human tidal wave across the known world. It was a masterclass in motivation, promising salvation, fortune, and a divinely sanctioned adventure. We witnessed the First Crusade, a chaotic, brutal, and astonishingly successful disaster. It was a glorious mess that, against all logic and reason, actually managed to capture Jerusalem, leaving a river of blood in its wake. Then came the awkward reality of trying to hold the conquered land. The Crusader states were a precarious experiment in colonial rule, like building a giant sandcastle on a hostile shore and constantly yelling at the tide to back off. We saw European kings try their hand at the game in the Second Crusade, only to prove that celebrity endorsements do not, in fact, guarantee a successful product launch. It was an expensive, embarrassing, and complete failure. Our story found a pivotal character in Saladin, a brilliant leader who complicates any simple narrative of good versus evil. He united a fractured Muslim world and retook Jerusalem, often demonstrating a magnanimity that his opponents sorely lacked. The Third Crusade was the heavyweight championship bout, Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin. It was a clash of legends that cost a fortune, spilled oceans of blood, and ended not with a knockout, but with a handshake and an uneasy truce. And then, of course, we have the Fourth Crusade, the point in the story where the plot completely imploded. It was the Holy War that got distracted, forgot who the enemy was supposed to be, and decided to just sack its Christian allies in Constantinople instead. It was a cynical, greedy, and catastrophic betrayal that irrevocably shattered the crusading ideal. It's the medieval equivalent of your Uber driver convincing you to help him rob a bank because you're a little short on the fare. After that fiasco, the fire began to fade. The later Crusades were mostly desperate, poorly planned afterthoughts, a series of futile attempts to recapture a glory that was never really there to begin with. And we paused our main narrative to reflect on the most heartbreaking footnote of all the Children's Crusade. It remains a tragic testament to what happens when pure, naive faith collides with the harshest aspects of reality. Now, after all that, after unpacking centuries of conflict, the biggest question still hangs in the air: why? Why did this happen, not just once, but over and over again, for 200 years? The easy answer is religion, but that's like saying the Titanic sank because it was wet. It's true, but it misses the entire complicated human point. Faith was the banner, but it wasn't the only reason people marched. For many of the knights and nobles at the heart of the story, it was a perfect storm of piety, ambition, and a distinct lack of opportunity at home. Europe's feudal system was churning out a surplus of violent, landless second and third-born sons. The Crusades were a divine permission slip for them to do what they did best: fight. But this time, they could win land, plunder, and a guaranteed ticket to heaven all at once. It was the ultimate medieval career move, a holy gap year with benefits. Then there was the raw politics of it all. The papacy, a rising power in Europe, saw a golden opportunity to unite the continent's fractious warlords under a single banner, its banner. It was a brilliant geopolitical strategy to redirect Europe's violent energies outward. And we cannot forget the simple, earthly motive of greed. the merchants of Venice and Genoa saw a holy war and heard the beautiful sound of coins clinking. They provided the ships, the supplies, and the loans, turning piety into a staggeringly profitable business. It was a complex tapestry of motivations. Genuine, heartfelt faith was woven together with naked, cynical ambition. Devout peasants marched alongside political schemers, and pious pilgrims fought next to war profiteers. It was a deeply human mess. And in all this talk of popes, kings, and grand strategies, it is terrifyingly easy to forget the most important element, the people, the ordinary, unfamous men and women whose lives were trampled under the march of history. Think of the peasant in Germany who stitched a cross to his tunic, convinced he was doing God's work. He walked 1,000 miles, only to die of disease in a dusty camp in Anatolia, his faith real, his sacrifice absolute, his death a mere statistic. Think of the families, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish alike, who lived in the cities of the Levant. One decade they were ruled by an Arab emir, the next by a French lord, their lives and livelihoods subject to the whims of faraway powers. The chronicles of the Crusaders themselves describe the capture of Jerusalem with a chilling sense of accomplishment. They write of wading through streets flowing with the blood of the city's inhabitants, of killing in a frenzy of righteous victory. It's a horrifying reminder that the line between a pilgrim and a perpetrator can be terrifyingly thin. This cycle of violence and retaliation created generations of trauma, with each atrocity justifying the next. Nowhere is this human cost more stark than in the story of the Children's Crusade, a movement of thousands of young people believing their innocence could succeed where armies had failed, marching towards a miracle. Their devastating fate, tricked, sold into slavery, or simply lost to the unforgiving world, is a gut-wrenching indictment of the entire crusading phenomenon. It's the ultimate symbol of the exploitation of faith and the profound suffering it left in its wake. So, after all that blood and treasure, what did it actually change? The Crusader states, the entire objective of the 2-century-long war, were eventually erased from the map. From that perspective, it was a colossal, undeniable failure. There's a popular idea that the Crusades were ultimately good for Europe, that they brought back the lost knowledge of the classical world from the East. But this is a convenient simplification. Much of that intellectual transfer was already happening, more peacefully and effectively, in places like Spain and Sicily. In reality, the Crusades did far more to poison relations than to foster exchange. They created a narrative of a clash of civilizations and a deep-seated animosity that has echoed through the centuries. They dug a trench between worlds. The sack of Constantinople in 1204, in particular, was an act of civilizational vandalism. It crippled the Byzantine Empire, the great Christian shield in the East, and created a bitterness between Western and Eastern Christianity that has never fully healed. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crusades was psychological. For the West, it solidified the concept of the crusade itself, a holy mission, a righteous war that justifies any means. It's a political tool that has been used again and again. For the Muslim world, it was a deeply traumatic invasion by foreign armies. The memory of the Frange would shape attitudes and responses to Western intervention for 1,000 years. These wars helped draw the hard lines of identity between USAs and them on a global scale. And on that rather sobering note, our long night's history is complete. Thank you for staying with us through this incredibly complex, often brutal, and deeply human chapter of our shared past. We know it was a long one. It's a history that challenges easy answers and comfortable myths. What part of this sprawling, messy epic surprised you or stuck with you the most? Let us know down in the comments below. We genuinely love reading your perspectives. If you appreciate this kind of deep dive that attempts to dismantle the simpler stories we tell about the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. It's the best way to let us know we should keep digging. We have plenty of other historical rabbit holes for you to fall into. You can check out another video on your screen right now. Until next time, try and get some rest. And remember that history is never as simple as we wish it were. Sleep well.